Before I show you the moment the world shifted, I need you to do something for me. I need you to stop what you are doing
No,
right
let me
now
go!
and
You can't
stay
do this!
right here. Because what you are about to see is the kind of mistake that ends empires. Two men in black suits grabbed a young woman by her arms and dragged her toward a running car in the middle of a rain-slicked driveway. They did it with a smirk on their faces. They did it like she was a piece of trash they'd been ordered to take to the curb. They did it like there was absolutely nobody in that city who could stop them or make them answer for the bruises they were leaving on her skin. And they were wrong, because watching from a leather chair inside a darkened office was a man whose name makes the streets of Rome go silent. A man who had built a syndicate on blood and whiskey. A man who set down his glass, stood up slowly, and looked through that window, not with pity, but with the cold, calculating hunger of a wolf who thinks he just found a lamb. What that man did not know in that moment, and what the two men throwing her into the back seat did not yet realize, was that the girl in the maid's uniform, with her hair falling into her face and her mouth open in a silent plea, was the most dangerous weapon the Italian Mafia ever created. This is her story. Every calculated tear, every hidden blade, and the moment the predator realizes he's actually the prey.
I remember the exact way the floorboards felt against my knees that morning. They were cold, polished, and smelled of lemon wax. It was the kind of floor that belongs to people who have never had to clean one themselves. I was kneeling in the hallway of the ambassador's estate, my black dress smoothed over my legs, my white apron spotless. I was practicing my invisibility. That had become my greatest skill over the last 5 years, taking up no space, breathing so quietly people forgot I had lungs, keeping my eyes on the floor until I became part of the furniture. Officially, on the payroll of this house, I was Alana Lilly, a disposable girl from the countryside with no family and even less ambition. That was the mask. It was a mask I had worn so long that sometimes, when I looked in the mirror, I had to remind myself of the weight of a Beretta in my palm. Behind me, the heavy oak doors of the study burst open. I didn't flinch. I didn't look up. I just kept scrubbing. 2 men, Adalmio and Tarquinio, marched toward me. I knew their names. I knew their kill counts. I knew they worked for Remo Ferri, the man my father had sent me to destroy. Adalmio didn't say a word. He just reached down and fistfulled the fabric of my uniform, hauling me to my feet so fast my shoes slipped on the wax. Tarquinio laughed. It was a sharp, ugly sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "The boss wants a word with the help," he sneered, his grip tightening on my other arm until I felt the bone groan. I let my body go limp. I let my eyes fill with a terrified, watery shine. I let my bottom lip tremble just enough to make them feel powerful. They dragged me down the hall, my heels scuffing the expensive rugs, toward the black sedan waiting outside like a coffin. I saw Remo Ferri then. He was sitting in the back of the car, his face half hidden in the shadows, swirling a glass of amber liquid. He didn't even look at me. To him, I was a bargaining chip, a piece of leverage, a nothing. As they threw me into the seat beside him and the door slammed shut with a heavy, final thud, my hand went to my skirt, feeling the thin, cold wire hidden in the hem. The car began to move. Remo finally turned his head, his eyes cold and dismissive. "Don't cry, little bird," he said, his voice like silk over gravel. "If you're lucky, you'll be dead before you become a problem." I looked at him, letting a single tear fall, but inside I was counting the seconds until we passed his front gates, because I knew, with every nerve in my body, that I wasn't his prisoner. He was mine. The transition from the ambassador's estate to the Ferry stronghold was a blur of calculated silence and deliberate vulnerability. As the black sedan cut through the rain-slicked streets of the city, I kept my head bowed, staring at my hands. They were trembling, not because I was afraid, but because I was keeping my muscles in a state of constant low-level tension, a trick to ensure my terror looked authentic to the two men flanking me. Adelmio leaned back, the scent of expensive tobacco and cheap aggression clinging to his suit. He didn't see a threat. He saw a girl whose world had just collapsed. To him, the maid's uniform was a badge of insignificance. He didn't know that every stitch in this apron had been modified. He didn't know that the soft white collar hiding the pulse in my neck also concealed a microtransmitter. "Stop shaking," Tarquinio muttered from the front seat, his eyes catching mine in the rearview mirror. "You're making the upholstery nervous." I let out a small, jagged breath, the sound of a girl on the verge of a breakdown. "Where are you taking me? I haven't done anything. I just work there." "You work for a man who owes our boss a debt he can't pay," Adelmio said, his voice dripping with bored cruelty. "That makes you interest on the loan, sweetheart." I looked out the window as we passed the heavy iron gates of the Ferry estate. This was the target. For 3 months, I had played the role of the clumsy, quiet maid at the ambassador's house, knowing Remo Ferry's intelligence team was watching. I had dropped just enough accidental information about the ambassador's private ledgers to make myself the most valuable piece of leverage in the room. I had practically hand-delivered the kidnapping plot to them, acting the part of the disposable witness until they finally took the bait. The car came to a halt in a courtyard paved with ancient stone. The air here was different, colder, heavier, thick with the arrogance of old money and new blood. Adelmio hauled me out of the car, his fingers digging into the bruises he'd already made. "Move," he barked. I stumbled, my knees hitting the wet gravel, the classic image of a broken girl. As I was dragged toward the massive oak doors of the villa, I wasn't looking for an exit. I was mapping the security cameras. I was counting the guards, 4 on the perimeter, 2 at the main entrance, all carrying standard-issue sidearms. Inside, the house was a cathedral of stolen wealth. Chandelier light fractured against the marble floors, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic click of my heels and the heavy boots of my captors. They led me toward a set of double doors at the end of the hall. This was the performance of a lifetime. If I slipped, if my gaze turned too sharp or my stance too steady, I wouldn't just be a maid anymore, I would be a corpse. "The boss is waiting," Adelmio whispered, pushing me forward. I stepped into the room, my eyes wide and swimming with manufactured tears, ready to meet the man who thought he had stolen a maid, but had actually invited his own ghost through the front door. The air in the study was thick with the scent of cedarwood, expensive tobacco, and the sharp, medicinal bite of high-end whiskey. It was a room designed to make a person feel small, dominated by a desk carved from a single slab of dark mahogany, and walls lined with leather-bound books that looked like they hadn't been touched in a century. In the center of it all sat Remo Ferry. He didn't look up when I was pushed into the room. He was focused on the amber liquid swirling in his glass, the ice clinking softly against the crystal like a countdown. I collapsed onto the floor, my knees hitting the plush Persian rug with a muffled thud. I made sure my breathing was shallow and ragged, the sound of a trapped animal. "Stand up," he said. His voice was a low, melodic baritone that didn't carry a hint of anger. That was the most dangerous thing about him, the lack of heat. I pushed myself up slowly, my hands shaking as I smoothed the wrinkled fabric of my white apron. I kept my chin tucked, looking at his handmade leather shoes rather than his face. "Look at me, Alana." I lifted my head, letting him see the terror in my eyes. Remo was older than he looked in the surveillance photos, sharper, his features etched with the kind of weariness that only comes from decades of ordering executions. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, his dark eyes scanning me with the clinical detachment of a jeweler inspecting a flawed stone. "The ambassador spoke very highly of your discretion," Remo remarked, leaning back in his chair. He said you were the only one in the house who knew how to be silent, that you have a way of being in a room without being noticed. I just do my job, sir," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly. "Please, I don't know why I'm here. I don't have any money." Remo let out a short, dry chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. He rose from his chair and walked around the desk, his movements fluid and predatory. He stopped inches away from me. I could smell the peat of the scotch on his breath. He reached out, his thumb and forefinger catching my chin and tilting my face upward. His skin was cold. "Money is the least interesting thing you possess, Alana," he murmured. He held his whiskey glass up, the light from the desk lamp refracting to the liquid and casting golden, distorted shadows across my face. "You possess proximity. You see the things the ambassador hides when he thinks the help is just a ghost. And now you're going to give those things to me." He let go of my chin and stepped back, taking another sip. "Adilmio will show you to your quarters. You'll find a new uniform there. From tomorrow, you'll be cleaning this house, and every evening you'll sit in that chair and tell me one secret you overheard in your old life." I lowered my eyes, hiding the sudden lethal spark of triumph behind my lashes. He thought he was recruiting a spy. He thought he was breaking a spirit. He didn't realize that by putting me in his house and giving me a uniform, he had just granted me total access to his jugular. "Yes, sir," I breathed, sounding utterly defeated. Remo drained his glass and set it down on the mahogany with a final, echoing clink. "Good girl. Don't make me regret keeping you alive." Adilmio and Tarquinio were never far away. They were the twin shadows of the fairy estate, two different brands of cruelty designed to ensure no one ever felt truly alone. As I moved through the vaulted corridors the following morning, the weight of their gaze felt like a physical pressure against my spine. I carried a bucket of soapy water and a tray of silver polish, my shoulders hunched in the universal posture of a woman who had already been broken. Adilmio was the first to test the boundaries. I was polishing the heavy brass sconces in the east wing when he stepped into my space, his shadow eclipsing the light. He didn't speak, he simply leaned against the wall, watching the rhythmic movement of my cloth. He was the silent type, the kind of man who enjoyed the psychological theater of intimidation. He reached out and snagged a strand of my hair that had escaped its tie, twisting it around a scarred finger. "The boss thinks you're a treasure chest," he whispered, his voice a low vibration near my ear. "But I think you're just a girl who's going to trip over her own lies. I'm the one who cleans up the messes in this house, Alana. Don't become a stain I have to scrub out." I let a small, choked sob escape my throat, my hands trembling so violently that the polish cloth fell to the floor. I didn't look at him, I just stared at his polished boots, projecting a level of frailty that made his lip curl in disgust. He wanted me to be a victim. I gave him a martyr. Tarquinio, however, was a different animal. While Adilmio used silence, Tarquinio used noise and chaos. I found him waiting for me in the kitchen later that afternoon. He was tossing a heavy combat knife into the air and catching it by the hilt, the blade catching the afternoon sun. "Hey, Cinderella," he sneered, blocking the doorway as I tried to pass with a stack of fresh linens. He stepped forward, the tip of the knife grazing the white fabric of my apron, just over the heart. "Adilmio thinks you're a treasure chest," he said. "I just think you're a waste of a good suit. Tell me, does the ambassador's help always shake this much, or are you special?" I shrank back against the doorframe, the linens clutched to my chest like a shield. I'm just trying to do what Mr. Fairy asked," I stammered, my voice barely audible. Tarquinio leaned in, his eyes wide and manic. He liked the fear, he fed on it. He didn't notice the way my thumb traced the seam of the linen stack, or the fact that my eyes had already noted the slow reaction time of his left wrist. He was fast, but he was arrogant. Arrogance was a luxury I could use to kill him whenever I chose. They were the twin shadows, meant to keep me in the dark, but as I watched them walk away, leaving me trembling in the hallway, I felt the cold, familiar thrill of the hunt. They thought they were the ones watching me. They had no idea I was already deciding which one of them would be the first to fall. By the third day, I had become a ghost in the machinery of the fairy estate. I moved through the halls with a bucket of water and a duster, a silent fixture that the guards no longer bothered to track. To them, I was just a part of the background, as inanimate as the statues lining the foyer. They didn't see the way my eyes flickered toward the keypad entry of the server room, or how I timed the rotation of the security cameras to the second. Cleaning Remo's private study was the most delicate part of the dance. It was a room that demanded a shaking hand and a bowed head. As I knelt to dust the intricate scroll work of his mahogany desk, I could feel Remo's presence behind me. He was sitting in his armchair, the familiar clink of ice against crystal punctuating the silence. He was watching me, waiting for the girl to break, for the maid to spill a secret that would justify his kidnapping of her. "You're very thorough, Alana," he remarked, his voice a low vibration that crawled up my spine. "I wrecked him. He didn't like dust, sir," I whispered, keeping my back to him. He said it was a sign of a cluttered mind. I reached into the hidden compartment of my cleaning caddy, my movements fluid and practiced. While my right hand made broad, frantic strokes with the duster to keep his eyes occupied, my left hand slipped a device no larger than a grain of rice into the underside of his desk. It was a high-frequency acoustic glass break sensor, modified to record every vibration in the room. As I moved to the bookshelves, I transitioned from planting to purging. Remo's inner circle communicated via encrypted flash drives hidden behind classic literature, a predictable old-world habit. I pulled a leather-bound copy of the Divine Comedy from the shelf, pretending to wipe the spine. In the 3 seconds my body shielded the book from his view, I swapped his drive with a mirrored duplicate, preloaded with a slow-acting worm. In 48 hours, his entire financial network would begin to hemorrhage data directly to my father's servers in Rome. "You're very quiet today," Remo said, his shadow stretching across the floor until it touched my knees. I turned slightly, letting him see a flicker of distress on my face. "I'm just tired, sir. The house is so big. I don't want to make a mistake." He stood up, walking toward me until the toes of his hand-stitched shoes were inches from my hem. He reached out, his fingers grazing the white lace of my collar, checking for a wire he assumed a girl like me wouldn't know how to wear. I didn't breathe. I let my heart race, not from fear, but from the thrill of the sabotage. He found nothing but skin and fabric. "Your mistakes in this house are expensive," he whispered, his eyes searching mine for a truth he wasn't equipped to find. "But keep cleaning. I'm starting to like having you around." I dipped into a shallow, submissive curtsy. "Yes, sir." As I backed out of the room, bucket in hand, I felt the invisible threads of his empire beginning to fray. He thought he was watching a Maid. He didn't realize he was watching the countdown to his own destruction. The tension in the fairy estate was a living thing, a coiled viper waiting for a reason to strike. I was in the servants' scullery, wringing out a heavy mop, when the silence of the afternoon was shattered by a sharp, wet thud and a cry of pain. I froze, the water dripping from my fingers. Through the cracked door of the pantry, I saw Tarquinio. He had cornered Elena, a young kitchen maid who couldn't have been older than 19. She was cowering against a shelf of preserves, a broken jar of cherries bleeding red syrup across her white stockings. Tarquinio stood over her, his face twisted into that manic, bored grin I'd come to loathe. He wasn't angry about the mess. He was simply enjoying the sight of something fragile breaking. "That was expensive, Elena," Tarquinio hummed, the silver blade of his pocket-knife flicking open with a lethal snick. The boss doesn't like clumsy girls. Maybe I should help you remember to be more careful. A little mark on the hand, perhaps?" Elena's sobbing was a frantic, hitching sound. She looked at him with the pure, unadulterated terror of someone who knew no one was coming to save her. In that moment, the Alana I had spent weeks building, the trembling, disposable maid, vanished. My spine straightened, my center of gravity shifted, dropping low and steady into the stance of a predator. My hand moved instinctively toward the back of my waist, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there, my fingers twitching with the muscle memory of 1,000 kill shots. I could see the trajectory. 2 steps to bridge the gap, a palm strike to his chin to disorient the equilibrium, followed by a tactical sweep of his lead leg. I could have his knife in my hand and his throat crushed before he could even blink. The air in the room seemed to sharpen. Tarquinio paused, his head tilting like a dog catching a scent. He didn't see me, but he felt the sudden violent change in the atmosphere. The temperature had dropped to 0. "Don't," my father's voice echoed in my mind. "The mission is the priority. A weapon is only useful if it remains hidden. If I saved her, the mask would shatter. Remo would know. The data worm would be purged. My father's empire would fall." I watched Tarquinio raise the knife, the light glinting off the steel, and I felt a cold, jagged rage tear at my chest. I had to choose, the girl or the war. At the last possible second, I didn't spring. Instead, I let out a loud, clumsy crash, sending my galvanized bucket spinning across the floor. The clatter was deafening in the small space. "Oh, oh no!" I wailed, my voice jumping back into the high, frantic pitch of the maid. I stumbled into the pantry, tripping over my own feet and falling between them. Tarquinio jumped back, his eyes snapping to me. The murderous trance was broken, replaced by his usual sneering contempt. He looked at me, then at the sobbing Elena, and huffed a breath of disgust. "Useless," he spat, folding his knife. "Both of you. Clean it up before I decide to give you something real to cry about." He kicked my bucket as he walked out, the metal ringing against the stone. I stayed on the floor, my hands buried in the cold cherry syrup, shaking with a fury I had to pretend was fear. I reached out to touch Elena's arm, my touch gentle, but my eyes remained fixed on the door. The mask was back in place, but it was cracked, and I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the next time I felt that surge of power, I wouldn't be able to hold it back. The following evening, the atmosphere in Remo's study had shifted from cold indifference to a suffocating, focused intensity. He didn't ask me to clean. He didn't ask for a secret. Instead, he sat in his leather chair, the whiskey glass forgotten on the desk, and watched me with the stillness of a man who had finally found a loose thread and intended to pull it until the whole garment unraveled. I was standing by the window, adjusting the heavy velvet curtains, when he finally spoke. "Tell me, Alana," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "where did you learn to fall?" I kept my back to him, my fingers tightening on the fabric. I don't understand, Mr. Ferry. I just tripped. I'm clumsy." I watched the security footage from the pantry 3 times. You didn't trip like a frightened girl. You moved like someone who was calculating the exact moment of impact to create the maximum amount of noise. You dropped your center of gravity before your knees even hit the floor. He was closer now. I could feel the heat radiating from him. I turned slowly, widening my eyes, letting them swim with a fresh layer of moisture. "I was scared, sir. Tarquinio, he had a knife. I thought he was going to hurt her." Remo stopped a foot away. He didn't look convinced. He reached out, not to catch my chin this time, but to take my right hand. He turned it over, his thumb tracing the palm and the base of my fingers. I kept my hand limp, but I knew what he was looking for, the telltale calluses of a shooter. I had spent years using pumice stones and acids to erode them, but to a man who lived by the gun, the texture of a hand spoke more than 1,000 words. "The ambassador's records say you've worked for him for 3 years," Remo murmured, his eyes locked on mine. "But I sent Adalmio to the village you claimed to be from. Strange thing, Alana. No one remembers a girl with your face. No one remembers a family called Lily." The air in the room felt like it was being sucked out. My heart hammered against my ribs, not with fear, but with the thrill of the hunt finally turning back on the hunter. He was smart, smarter than I had given him credit for, but he was still playing a game of shadows, and I was the one who owned the dark. I ran away," I stammered, my lip trembling. "I didn't want to be found. Please, sir, don't send me back." Remo leaned in, his face inches from mine. His expression wasn't angry, it was fascinated. It was the look of a man who had found a masterpiece hidden under a layer of cheap paint. "I'm not going to send you back. You're far too interesting for that. But from now on, you don't leave this floor. No more cleaning, Alana. No more invisibility. We're going to find out exactly what's hiding behind those pretty, terrified eyes." He let go of my hand, but the weight of his obsession remained. As he walked back to his desk, I realized the mission had changed. I was no longer just a ghost in his house. I was the center of his world. And in this world, the closer the target gets, the easier they are to kill. The fairy estate had been transformed into a gilded cage of excess. The Red Gala was the syndicate's annual display of dominance, a night where the air smelled of lilies and expensive cologne, masking the underlying scent of blood and betrayal. Tonight, the house was crawling with every high-ranking captain in the country. To any other observer, it was a party. To me, it was a target-rich environment. Remo had discarded my maid's uniform. In its place, he had provided a dress the color of a bruised plum, silk that clung to my skin like a second shadow. He wanted me visible tonight. He wanted to parade his mystery before his peers, keeping me at his side as a silent, beautiful trophy. He thought he was showing me off. He didn't realize he was giving the specter of Rome a front-row seat to his entire command structure. "Stay close, Alana," Remo murmured, his hand resting possessively on the small of my back as we moved through the ballroom. "Tonight the world sees what I've found. Don't let that mask of yours slip." I played my part to perfection. I kept my gaze low, my shoulders slightly hunched, the image of a kept woman overwhelmed by the splendor. But beneath the silk, strapped to my inner thigh, was a ceramic blade that wouldn't trip a metal detector. In my clutch, disguised as a lipstick, was the final uplink device. As the orchestra began a sweeping waltz, the distraction I'd spent days planting finally bore fruit. A server, a man I'd subtly bribed through a dead drop yesterday, tripped near the circuit breaker in the kitchen, accidentally dousing the main panel in champagne. The lights flickered and died. The ballroom erupted into a symphony of gasps and the frantic rustle of silk. In the 3 seconds of pure, unadulterated darkness, I wasn't a maid or a trophy. I was the weapon my father had forged. I slipped from Remo's side with the silence of a ghost. I didn't head for the exit. I headed for his private elevator. I hit the keypad with a sequence I'd memorized from the reflection in his whiskey glass days ago. The doors hissed open. As the elevator rose towards the sanctuary of his office, I felt the data worm I'd planted earlier finally reach its crescendo. My phone vibrated in my palm, the signal that the ferry servers were being bled dry. The elevator doors opened into the silent, moonlit office. I moved to the mahogany desk, my fingers flying over the keys of his private terminal. The encryption keys were within reach. The final blow to the fairy empire was seconds away. but as the screen glowed blue, reflecting in my eyes, the heavy oak doors of the office clicked shut behind me. I wondered how long it would take for the mouse to stop hiding. A voice echoed from the shadows. The lights didn't come back on, but I didn't need them to know who was standing there. Remo Ferry hadn't stayed at the party. He had been waiting for me to come home. The silence in the office was absolute, save for the rhythmic humming of the servers as they bled out Remo's life's work. He stepped out of the shadows, not with a gun drawn, but with a look of twisted admiration. Behind him, the doors opened again, and the twin shadows filled the frame. Adelmio looked stoic, but Tarquinio's face was a mask of pure, murderous glee. "You should have stayed in the ballroom, Alana," Remo said, his voice terrifyingly calm, "or whoever you are." "The name is Alana," I said, my voice finally shedding its tremor. I stood up straight, the submissive curve of my spine snapping into a line of steel. I reached down, pulled the silk of the plum dress upward, and unsheathed the ceramic blade from my thigh in one fluid motion. "But in your world, they usually call me the Spectre." Tarquinio's smirk vanished. The air in the room didn't just drop in temperature, it became lethal. "The boss of Rome's daughter?" Adelmio whispered, his hand going to his holster. "Don't," I warned, my voice a cold edge. Tarquinio didn't listen. He lunged, driven by the ego I'd spent days bruising. He was fast, but to me he was moving through water. I stepped inside his guard, the silk of my dress whistling as I spun. My elbow connected with his jaw, a wet, crunching sound, and before he could recover, I drove the ceramic blade into the nerve cluster of his shoulder. He dropped like a stone, the knife he'd used to threaten Elena clattering uselessly across the marble. Adelmio drew his beretta, but I was already moving. I flipped the heavy mahogany chair, using the solid wood as a momentary shield, as a bullet splintered the leather. I rolled, coming up behind the desk, and launched a heavy crystal decanter at his head. He flinched, a split-second error, and it was the only window I needed. I closed the distance in 3 strides, disarming him with a wrist lock that sent his gun spinning. I delivered a localized strike to his solar plexus, folding the mountain of a man in half. I stood over them, breathing evenly, the plum silk stained with Tarquinio's blood. I turned my gaze to Remo. He hadn't moved. He was leaning against the doorframe, watching his 2 best men groveling on the floor. "You didn't kidnap a maid, Remo," I said, stepping over Adelmio's prone body. I walked toward him, the blade held low and steady. "The only life belongs to my father." I pressed the tip of the ceramic blade against the hollow of his throat, right above the silk tie he wore so elegantly. "Your life belongs to my father." Remo didn't flinch. He looked down at the blade, then up at me, a dark, jagged laugh escaping his throat. "Then tell me, Spectre, why haven't you killed me yet?" "Because," I whispered, leaning in until our breaths mingled, "dead men can't watch their empires burn." The smoke from the burning servers began to fill the office, a gray shroud for a dying dynasty. I pulled the blade back just enough to let Remo breathe, though I never lowered the steel. Outside the window, the first sirens began to wail in the distance. Not the local police Remo had in his pocket, but the federal task force my father had activated the moment the data uplink hit 100%. "Look at them, Remo," I said, nodding towards Adelmio and Tarquinio, who were struggling to regain their footing. "The shadows you used to haunt the world are bleeding on your carpet. You built an empire on the assumption that the people serving you were beneath your notice. That was your first mistake. Your last was thinking you could own me." I reached into the pocket of my ruined silk dress and pulled out a small black burner phone. I tossed it on the desk. It slid through a pool of spilled whiskey and stopped at his fingertips. "That phone has 1 contact," I told him, my voice as cold as the Roman winter. "My father is waiting for your call. You have 2 choices. You can stay here and let the authorities find the evidence I've spent the last week gift wrapping for them, or you can pick up that phone and pledge the remains of the Fairy Syndicate to the House of Lily." Remo looked at the phone, then back at me. The obsession in his eyes hadn't faded. It had evolved into a grim, terrified respect. He realized then that I hadn't just infiltrated his home, I had colonized his mind. He was no longer the mastermind. He was a survivor in a world I had reshaped while he watched me dust his shelves. "You're leaving," he noted, his voice strained. "The maid's shift is over," I replied. I backed towards the balcony, the night air catching the plum silk of my dress. "The next time you see my face, it will be across a negotiation table, or through a high-powered scope. The choice, as always, is yours." I didn't wait for his answer. I vaulted over the stone balustrade, disappearing into the dark gardens I had mapped so carefully. By the time Remo reached the edge, I was gone, a ghost returning to the city that birthed it. 3 hours later, I stood in a private study in Rome that smelled of old parchment and real power. My father sat behind his desk, a glass of wine waiting for me. I was no longer wearing a uniform or a plum dress, but a tailored suit that fit like armor. "The fairy accounts?" he asked. "Liquidated and transferred," I said, taking a sip of the wine. "And Remo?" I looked out at the lights of the eternal city, thinking of the man currently staring at a black phone in a burning office. "He'll call. He knows the difference between a master and a god now." I set the glass down. The mission was over, the disposable girl was dead, and the specter was home. But as I looked at my hands, I noticed a lingering scent, the faint, clean smell of lemon wax. I smiled. It was a good reminder that in this world, the most dangerous people are the ones who know exactly how to clean up a mess.
6 months later, the dust had settled over the ruins of the Fairy Syndicate, but a new, quieter structure was rising in its place. In a gilded hotel suite overlooking the Venetian canals, Remo Ferri sat across from a man who had once been his sworn enemy, Alana's father, the supreme boss of the Italian Mafia. Remo looked older. The sharp edge of his arrogance had been blunted, replaced by the grim, focused energy of a man who had stared into the abyss and chosen to survive. He was no longer a king, but a regional manager, his operations absorbed, his profits taxed, his every move scrutinized by the Lily organization. "Your proposal for the Adriatic routes is acceptable," Alana's father noted, sliding a contract across the table. He took a sip of espresso, his eyes flat and unreadable. "But my lead counsel will review the finer points before I sign." The heavy oak doors of the suite opened, and Alana walked in. She was no longer wearing the plum silk dress or the white apron of a maid. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit like armor, her hair swept back in a severe, professional bun. She carried a sleek leather portfolio and moved with the easy, predatory confidence of a woman who owned the room before she even entered it. Remo's breath hitched in his throat. He hadn't seen her since the night she vanished from his balcony. His twin shadows, Adelmio and Tarquinio, were currently serving consecutive life sentences in a high-security prison, their testimony, beaten out of them by Alana's tactical data dump, the final nail in their own coffins. Alana didn't look at Remo as she took the seat next to her father. She opened her portfolio, her fingers moving over the complex legal documents with clinical precision. "Section 4, paragraph 12. Alana said, her voice dropping into that smooth, professional tone that held no hint of the trembling maid she had once played. "The exclusivity clause on the Venice port needs to be clarified. We control all incoming traffic, Remo, not just 40%. Remo stared at her, the memory of her kneeling on his study floor, dusting his shelves, washing over him. It was a phantom limb, a ghost of a power structure that had never truly existed. He picked up his pen, his hand steady, and signed the document without looking at the text. "As you wish," he murmured.
As he was escorted out by two of her father's guards, Remo paused in the doorway. He looked back at Alana, who was already discussing logistics with her father. He realized that the deepest wound she had inflicted wasn't the loss of his empire or the betrayal of his trust. It was the fact that he could never again walk into a room, see a waiter, a valet, or a maid, and not wonder if he was looking at his own executioner. Alana caught his gaze for a single fleeting second. She didn't smile, she just held his eyes, letting him see the specter behind the council mask. Then she picked up her espresso cup. The clink of the fine china against the saucer was quiet, nearly invisible, but to Remo it sounded exactly like a countdown. Remo Ferri was a mastermind of complex criminal strategies, yet he failed because he defined power only through volume and force. He judged Alana Lilly by her uniform, her gender, and her socioeconomic status, the very things he deemed disposable. In his world, a maid was a servant, not a threat. A woman was a pawn, not a queen. By defining Alana as insignificant help, Remo stopped truly seeing her. He granted her access to his inner sanctum, his financial data, and his psychological vulnerabilities simply because he was too arrogant to believe that someone beneath him could destroy him. Alana didn't defeat him through superior firepower. She defeated him through superior information, using his own bias as her shield. The story serves as a reminder that the strongest weapon in any conflict isn't always the one that makes the most noise. True power often lies in the shadows, waiting for the arrogant to forget that the person holding the duster can also hold the knife.